Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So in January of 2025, I presented a tutorial entitled Change Detection for Websites. And change detection is an open source project that helps track changes to websites, just as it says in its title. So I use it to monitor things like new releases of open source projects or price changes on products that I'm watching. But today's tutorial is going to focus on a relatively new project named PriceBuddy. And so PriceBuddy is an open source web application that allows users to compare product prices across multiple online retailers and receive alerts when those prices change. And at the time of this presentation, PriceBuddy was right around 6 months old. And so, as is the case with most of my tutorials, the real goal is not exactly to just host the application itself, but my hope is that we can learn along the way about various infrastructure details, deployment quirks, as well as troubleshooting. And so I initially attempted to host PriceBuddy using the author's very straightforward and simple quick start script that you see here. And while this worked, in principle it did work out of the box, but for me, there were a few subtle but important issues. And one of the first things that I encountered was trying to change the default username and password. And this turned out to be a problem occasionally, and sometimes a big problem, because I would log off and log back in again, and the default password wasn't working, but also the password I had changed it to was not working at all. And this turned out to be related to something called Laravel, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Laravel, I guess is what it is. And it's basically a PHP framework that was used to develop PriceBuddy. And it's a very popular framework known for features like routing, authentication, database migrations, and its so-called elegant syntax that simplifies application development. And so Laravel relies heavily on configuration parameters that are in a .env file, like a lot of Docker applications, and it relies on those values for things like its database credentials, application keys, and environmental settings. And so it expects specific web server behavior when running under Apache and Nginx to provide properly served dynamic PHP content. And so that's where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. So these expectations became more complicated when Laravel is deployed inside of a Docker container. And clearly, this PriceBuddy application is a Docker stack with 3 Docker containers inside of it. And so that introduces its own networking, startup order, and service dependency nuances. And another issue appeared once the application was running. If I rebooted either the Incus container or the Incus server, PriceBuddy would start up and the stack looked like it was running really great, but unfortunately it returned a 502 error when you would access the web page. And that 502 error is a 502 bad gateway error. And so that really looks like an Nginx proxy manager issue, but at that time I was accessing it locally and I had not yet tried to introduce any kind of a reverse proxy. So I found that that could be temporarily resolved if I simply did either a Docker compose down and Docker compose up -d. And so the root cause was that the application container was starting before the database was fully ready. And that took me a while because when I looked at the Docker compose logs, that was not particularly obvious. So the fix was to add proper startup dependencies in the Docker Compose file so that PriceBuddy as an application would not start before the database container was fully up and available online. And so my original plan was I wanted to host PriceBuddy behind Nginx Proxy Manager. And so after about 12 hours of experimentation, and yes, these videos really do take a really long time to do research on because things do not necessarily behave out of the box as you would hope that they would. So after about 12 hours, I wasn't able to get past these issues that I was having. And the biggest issue was I kept having what was called a 505 error, an HTTP 505 error, which is a mishandled X-forwarded for or X-forwarded proto header error. And Apache inside of the container was rejecting the proxied requests that were coming from Nginx Proxy Manager. And so that was a little bit of a first for me because I had always used Nginx Proxy Manager to host my applications that I wanted to host online with a subdomain. And so unfortunately, this one was particularly persnickety, and no amount of advanced headers that I added to Nginx Proxy Manager was solving my problem. So much of this appeared to stem from Laravel's trusted proxy interacting poorly with the Docker networking, and then that was even compounded by Nginx Proxy Manager. So since I still wanted public access to my PriceBuddy instance, I ultimately chose to use a Cloudflare tunnel. And I know I've presented Cloudflare tunnels on the channel before, but it's certainly been a few years since I did. So the beauty of Cloudflare tunnels is that obviously they bypass Nginx Proxy Manager entirely. We no longer need Nginx Proxy Manager, and it exposes the container through a secure outbound tunnel. And so with Cloudflare tunnels, Cloudflare handles the TLS termination externally, and it forwards traffic directly to the PriceBuddy container with properly formatted HTTPS headers without any kind of a redirection. And so this avoids Apache versus Nginx proxy conflicts and Laravel trusted proxy issues altogether. In fact, even though the author has a section on reverse proxy, I had yet to get that to actually work. And after scouring the internet, I could only find one other video that someone had done about PriceBuddy, but it really didn't address the issue of reverse proxy. And it looked to me like he was proxying or not proxying, but offering it on a direct WAN address. So the other thing about Cloudflare Tunnel is that, if I hadn't mentioned it earlier, is that it is not directly exposed via a public IP address, and that improves your security. And they're also extremely useful for hosting applications behind CGNAT, because CGNAT folks do not have a dedicated WAN address. So one limitation to be aware of is that Cloudflare tunnels are best suited for HTTP or HTTPS-based applications. And services that require arbitrary inbound ports or non-HTTP protocols may not be a good fit. So, for example, you could not be expected to host something like RustDesk through a Cloudflare tunnel. And so the final challenge, or the final hosting challenge for PriceBuddy that I was having, was providing a valid health check endpoint, which was not built into the application as it is built into many applications. So having a health check endpoint, excuse me, is useful for monitoring tools like Uptime Kuma and Labdash to track whether the application is online or offline. So in the end, I created a small static HTML endpoint that could be used as a reliable health check, and I incorporated it into the Docker Compose file. So with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at PriceBuddy and walk through how it works exactly, and also exactly how you can install PriceBuddy. Here we are at my Labdash dashboard, and in April of 2025, I presented a video on this highly customizable self-hosted dashboard. And previously, I had used Heimdall for several years, but I ended up moving over to Labdash because of all the features it has. If you look down here in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that I have an icon for PriceBuddy. And you'll also notice in the lower right-hand corner of that, I have a green indicator indicating that PriceBuddy is online. And once I click on that, it goes ahead and takes me over to the PriceBuddy dashboard. PriceBuddy does have a user authentication mechanism, and we'll cover that when we go to the installation part of the video. But right now, if we go up to the dashboard, you see here that I have a number of products listed under a number of categories that I have created myself. These categories are referred to as tags. So as an example, I have a memory and storage tag, a Unify tag, a Minisforum tag, and a Raspberry Pi tag. And under that, I have various products listed for which I am tracking prices. I can also go over here to the products dashboard, the products listing rather. We were on the dashboard, and in this listing we get a tabular listing of all of those products. If I head back up to the dashboard again and I click on one particular product, it will go ahead and bring up the detail on that product. In this particular case, I am tracking this from Amazon.com. I can also add additional URLs to track this product on other websites as well. And then I have the ability to go off and fetch the updates for it if I don't want to wait for it to perform the updates according to the schedule. And going down here, I also have the tags option. As I mentioned at the onset, I have 4 tags: a Unify tag, a Minisforum tag, a Raspberry Pi, and a memory and storage tag. You can simply click Add Tag to add another tag. Tags are simply categories that allow you to divide things into different segments. And then you also have the concept of stores. And by default, I guess they probably have somewhere around 25 stores that are in this project, but you can add your own. And as soon as you add a product from the dashboard that has a store that is not listed, it will automatically add that store to your list here. We can go over to the source area, and it says no product sources. I'm not entirely sure what the product sources are. If we click a plus, it will allow you to specify a product source, which is a website that you can use to search for all of your project or products. And so I haven't really played in depth with some of these features. If we go down to the settings option, when you set the system up originally, it will go ahead and ask you for a fetch schedule, and it uses a fetch schedule with the standard cron format. So here it's going to do a fetch every day at 6 a.m. And then you have a scrape cache time to live, and you have the number of seconds before fetching the next page, maximum number of attempts it does to do the scraping operation, where your locale is, which I guess sort of controls the language, and then the currency, which in my case is US dollars. We have here the log retention time, which by default is 30 days. And then we have a number of notifications you can set up. And so you can put in here anything that you want in terms of notifications. And so I have SMTP email set up as a notification. I did not set up pushover, but that's an option. Since I use Godify, and I covered that in my network monitoring tools presentation where we covered both Godify and Apprise, it also supports Apprise here in addition. So then you have integrations down here, and one of the integrations is an integration for Seer XNG. And I think that if you specify your self-hosted instance of Seer XNG, which is another video I've covered, then the product has the ability to go off and return searches for products, but directly from inside the program. The other thing we have here is we have the ability to create new user accounts, and then you have log messages that will specify what's going on, and these log errors were because I was in the process of configuring the program properly. And finally, you can click on Help, which goes over to his website and gets you into all of the documentation. Here we are at the command prompt for one of my many Incus servers, and we're going to host PriceBuddy inside of an Incus container. And so the Docker application for PriceBuddy will be nested inside of an Incus container. And certainly, if you are not running Incus or don't want to, you can host this application on your own system or inside of a virtual machine. So here I'm doing an Incus launch, images, Ubuntu 2404. I'm calling the name of the container PriceBuddy. I'm setting the default profile as well as the bridge profile to project this to an address out of my main LAN. And I am setting boot.autostart to true, which means that when the Incus server starts, this container starts. And finally, I'm doing a security.nesting equal to true. And the purpose of that is to be able to support the Docker application inside of the Incus container. Next, I'm connecting to that Incus container with an Incus shell over to PriceBuddy. As soon as you create a new container, the first thing you want to do is take all of the updates that that container has by updating the repositories and then doing an upgrade on any components in the operating system that require an upgrade. So we're doing an apt update, ampersand apt upgrade. The ampersand says if the first command is successful, then proceed and do the second command. And so I'm hitting enter here. It's going up and doing the apt update, and it does the apt upgrade. And there were no products in the operating system that needed to be updated. So the next thing we want to do is install some dependencies. And those dependencies are going to be OpenSSH Server, Net-Tools, curl, GNUPG, and Nano. The -y on the end means go ahead and proceed without asking me if I want to take the updates. Since PriceBuddy is a Docker application, we also need to install Docker, so we're doing a curl and executing the script from the Docker website. With Docker now correctly installed, the next thing I'm going to do is add myself a username by doing an add user Scott. I'll provide Scott with a password, and I will verify that password. And then the next thing that I want to do is I am going to do a usermod -a, capital G, sudo docker Scott. So what this does is it puts Scott into both the sudo group and the Docker group. That allows me to perform privilege commands on the system, and it also allows me to perform Docker commands without sudo. Now with all that setup out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and do an SU over to Scott so that now I'm logged into the Scott account. First thing I'm going to do is do a makedir on PriceBuddy, and then I'm going to cd into the new folder that I just created. The first file that we're going to edit down in the PriceBuddy folder is going to be the Docker Compose file, and here I've named it compose.yml. So I do a nano on compose.yml, and due to the magic of video, I already have the contents in here, which will be in the show notes. This application has 3 Docker containers. It has an application container, simply called app, and that's the main PriceBuddy application. It also has a SQL database container, and it has a web scraper container. So to begin with here, we've got the latest tag on this Docker Compose file, and the reason for that is when there are new versions of the app out, you can simply do a Docker Compose pull. Here I'm using port 8080 to the left of the colon on the ports designator, and any time that you see a port section, you can change what's to the left of the colon but not what is to the right of the colon, because the internal code that the developer has written relies on this port number. Now, something else interesting to know, and a good piece of trivia, is any port number above 1024 is considered to be a user port. The reason that that is significant is because many times if you're trying to do a Docker application and use one of the lower numbered reserved port names, unless you're running with privilege, a lot of times you're not able to do that. So I pretty much left this at 8080 that the author had originally for this purpose. And I have a lot of other things, modifications that I've done along the way here. I expose a storage folder, so parallel to this compose.yaml file, we have a storage folder, and then we also have a .env file, and then I also have a health.html, and that's so that we can provide a health check endpoint for this application for things like the lab-menu system to tell if the application is up and running. So we have a series of environment variables, and you're going to find out later that these environment variables are going to be somewhat redundant, but they're required here as placeholders. And although you can change the database name, database username, and database passwords, I encourage you not to. And the reason for that is because since they're running inside of the Docker network, they really are secure and they're not offered out onto your public network. And then this particular application depends on the fact that the service is healthy. And then we have a command string that I ended up putting in here, and it's because looking at the author's original Docker Compose, he did not have something like this in here. And what was happening is when I would reboot my Incus container where I nested this Docker application, it would start and seem to be running fine, but you couldn't actually access the web page. And that's related, I think, to some of the requirements that they have with this Laravel software that I pointed out earlier, that PHP framework. It's very picky about timing. And then I've got this health check down here where I'm looking at this local health check URL, and we're going to add code for that inside of a script that I've created. Then we've got the database, pretty straightforward. Again, it's going to use those variables for the database name, the database username, and password. And we're also using those inside of a .env file that the script that I created is using. We have a .data folder, so there's a folder called data that's parallel to this compose file, and it's for the database. And so that's where the SQL database is stored. And again, the database has a health check in it. And then finally at the bottom, and pretty simply here, there's a container called scraper. And this uses this thing called the Selenium base, which is a web scraper that goes out and scrapes your web pages to acquire the information, which is kind of the purpose of PriceBuddy. So I'm going to do a Control-O and Enter to save the file out, and a Control-X to exit the nano editor. The other file that we need to create is this script that I set up. And so it's called setup underbar PriceBuddy.sh. And so this script I created because it was really complicated to set up this application, and it was really error prone. As a matter of fact, I put in no less than about 18 hours perfecting this script and making sure that it worked in every particular situation. And of course, it is included in the show notes. And so it asks for things like your domain name, your username, email, that sort of thing, which are all parameters that are required in the program. And then it creates this env file, and this is going to be familiar because, again, it's somewhat redundant because it has the database host, the username, password, database, so on there. And those are all things that are included in the compose file we just went through. But the way this application works, trust me, it really wants them in both locations. And then these things that are here in red are simply the app URL and the email and the password used to set up the account. And those are required to go into the .env file, which I'm building through this script. And something else notable here is we're creating this application not to run locally, but we're going to create this to run on a domain and be publicly available. And it has usernames and passwords, and so therefore you'll be able to access it from outside of your network. Now, if we move down in this file a little bit further, I've got some other things taking place where we edit that env file and include the environment variables that we're prompting for in the beginning. We're creating a series of required directories. We're creating a data directory, a storage directory, and an entire subfolder structure underneath that storage directory, including a folder called framework with the subfolders under it called cache, views, and sessions. And then we're creating a bootstrap folder as well. So once those folders are created, I'm creating a very small HTML file which is designed to be the health check endpoint, and its only job is to come back and say that the application is up and running if the application's up and running. Then I bring the app up with Docker Compose, and then I wait for the database to become available, which is really important. And then I have to perform a whole bunch of PHP commands in order to set up this database properly with all of its requirements. And then I create the admin user according to what we prompted for in the beginning. And then after we do that, we just print out a summary at the end. So I'm going to do a Control O and Enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the nano editor. Since we created a brand new script here, before we can run this, we need to go ahead and provide an execute privilege with the command chmod +X setup _ PriceBuddy.sh. And now that it has execute privilege, we can go off and run the script, and we do that with a /setup _ PriceBuddy.sh. So it will begin by prompting for the domain name. If you just hit enter, it's going to come back and tell you the domain name is required. So you're going to need a Cloudflare account in order to accomplish this, because this is going to create a CNAME up at cloudflare.com. Well, this script doesn't do that, but the Cloudflare tunnel that we're going to create later on will do that. So I'm going to go ahead and type in PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com as my domain name. It's going to prompt me for an admin username. I'm going to go ahead and make that Scott. And it's going to prompt me for an email. So I'll go ahead and put in vmsman@gmail.com. And if you like what you see here, you can always PayPal or Zelle me at that email if you are so inclined to buy me a cup of coffee. So I'll go ahead and make my admin password something really complex like 123456. I encourage you to come up with something a little bit better. It asks for a confirmation. I'm again going to type in 123456 and hit enter. It goes ahead and creates that env file we talked about. It creates all of that directory structure, and then it creates that health check web code in health.html. Then it starts the Docker containers, and it waits for the database. Yours will take just a little bit longer because I already had my Docker containers downloaded. And then it goes ahead and says the database is ready. And then it ensures that the admin user account that we prompted for above is actually created. And it says the admin user is ready. And it says your PriceBuddy setup is complete. Your admin email is this. Your site URL is this. And your health check URL is this down here. At this point, we really do have a running application, and you can do a Docker PS and see that the 3 containers are up and running. The first one here, PriceBuddy, is going to show that it is healthy if everything is up and running fine. The Selenium base web scraper does not have a healthy, but it is fine up and running. And then you have your MySQL database that again reports that it is healthy. And just as a little bit of a review, if we do an ls-al, otherwise known as long listing, it will go ahead and show the hidden file .env. It will go ahead and show the bootstrap folder, the data folder, and the storage folder, as well as the health.html. And of course we have our compose file here, and then the script that we use to set this whole thing up. And of course the compose file and the setup script will both be on the show notes. So one gotcha about PriceBuddy is that it uses that Laravel or Laravel or however that's pronounced PHP development system. And in combination with Docker, it does some kind of interesting things regarding the networking. And I tried to get this thing to run behind Nginx Proxy Manager, and after a couple of days of work, it just wasn't happening. And so for that reason, I decided to host this thing behind a Cloudflare tunnel, which is actually a little bit more straightforward. And it's also an opportunity here to learn something new. So I'm going to CD up to the top level of this folder. I'll do an ls, and we've got the PriceBuddy folder located here. And what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go ahead and do a git clone on the installation project for Cloudflare. And Cloudflare is the Cloudflare Zero Trust Tunnel daemon. Next, I'm going to go ahead and CD into this install Cloudflare folder that was just created. And if I do an ls-al down here, we don't have much of anything except for an install Cloudflare script. And so, as we do with all scripts, we're going to make sure that it has execute privilege by doing a chmod +x on install-cloudflare.sh. And finally, what we're going to do is run that script in order to install Cloudflare. It's going to ask for my sudo password, and then it says that it's installed successfully. Now that we have the Cloudflare Zero Trust utility installed, we want to do a Cloudflare tunnel logon. And so this is going to provide you a URL, which we want to go ahead and copy here by just dragging over this thing, and then I'll simply do a copy. When I head up to my web browser, you'll see here that I'm actually logged into my Cloudflare account, but I'm going to go ahead and open another browser tab, and I'll paste in that URL that I just cut from the terminal, and I'll go ahead and hit enter. And when it comes up, it will go ahead and say authorize Cloudflare tunnel. And so it says, please select the zone you want to add the tunnel to. And I have 3 domains here. I'm going to put this in Scotti-BYTE.com. So I'm going to click on Scotti-BYTE.com. You then get a pop-up that says authorize tunnel for Scotti-BYTE.com. And I'm going to click authorize. Once I click authorize, it will think for a little bit and it will tell me that I now have success. Once I return to the terminal, you can see that it's completed this. It says leave Cloudflare running to download the cert automatically, and it comes back and says you have successfully logged in. If I now do an ls-al, you'll notice that there is a .cloudflare folder. So we'll go ahead and cd into .cloudflare and see what's in that folder. So I do an ls-al down here, and I simply have a certificate. Now I want to actually create the tunnel up to Cloudflare. And the way I do that is a Cloudflare tunnel create, and I'm calling this PriceBuddy 2 because I already have a production version of PriceBuddy, and its name is PriceBuddy. So Cloudflare tunnel create PriceBuddy 2, and it says tunnel credentials have been written to this Cloudflare folder. And it says it has created the tunnel. So now if we do an ls-al, you'll see that added to this cert.pem, we have a JSON file here. Now I'm going to create a new file by doing a nano config.yml, and I'm going to go ahead and paste in some contents that I put in the show notes. And these contents were for an older tunnel that I had created and destroyed. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Control-O and enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the nano editor. Now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab this number here in the name of the JSON file, and we're going to copy that. Then we're going to go back into the editor. We're going to come over here for the credentials file. We're going to backspace and paste in the value that we just got. And then I'm going to come down here, and of course we want to change your host name to be whatever you want the CNAME that it's going to create. And you're going to want to make sure that that sets that up. And also, before you forget, on the very first line up here, we need to replace the tunnel colon, and we want to put in that same tunnel ID. So we have the tunnel ID on the first line, and then we have the tunnel ID for the name of the JSON file. We have the host name, in my case, PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com, and Cloudflare Tunnel will actually dynamically create a CNAME record up at Cloudflare to accomplish that. And then down here I have http://localhost:8080 because the application uses port 8080, and you won't be changing that. And then finally we have what to do in the event that it is not found, and it puts out a 404. So that's all there is to it. Really, the only thing you have to do is change your host name to what you want, and then put in your tunnel ID both on the first line and as the name of the JSON file. So I do a Control O and enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the nano editor. There's some pretty strict requirements on the permissions for that JSON file. So we want to do an ls-al, and we want to do a chmod, and then just in case, we're going to do a sudo chmod, because I'm not sure the permissions will let me change it the way it is, even though it is my file. We're going to do a sudo chmod 644 on this JSON file. So I'm going to do a Shift Control C and Shift Control V, which will paste it, and I'll hit enter, and that changes the permissions on the JSON file. In order to create a route for our tunnel, I'm going to do a Cloudflare tunnel route DNS, and I'm only calling this PriceBuddy 2 because I already have a tunnel called PriceBuddy. And so I'm pointing that to PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com, and what that means is it will go ahead and create the CNAME record up at Cloudflare. And so it says added the CNAME PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com, which will route this tunnel with that tunnel ID. And now we can test our tunnel by starting it with the command Cloudflare tunnel run PriceBuddy. And so that will go ahead and bring it up. I guess it's actually PriceBuddy 2 now that I think of it, because that's what I called my tunnel there. So the neat part about Cloudflare tunnels is you don't need any open ports on your router, because the connection is made from this system on up to Cloudflare. And so people are not accessing your WAN port, they're accessing an address at Cloudflare, which knows how to get to this location here. So I'm doing a Cloudflare tunnel run PriceBuddy 2, and that goes ahead and brings up the tunnel. And now I opened a new tab on my web browser, and I typed in PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com. I go ahead and hit enter, and it goes to the PriceBuddy sign-in page. So I'm going to type in vmsman@gmail.com, and for the password we had established 12345 6, and I'll click sign in, and magically here we are signed into our new installation of PriceBuddy, and it is using a Cloudflare Zero Trust Tunnel. Okay, so we're not really done here. We're going to come up here and log out of PriceBuddy, and when we do so, it returns back to the login or sign in prompt. Now, if we go down to our terminal once again and we do a Control-C, we're interrupting or stopping that tunnel because we ran that tunnel interactively. And if I head back up here to my web page and I refresh my web page, I get an error back and it says error 1033, Cloudflare tunnel error, and that's because the Cloudflare tunnel is no longer running. To correct the problem of always having to leave our Cloudflare tunnel up and running in a terminal all the time, we're going to create a systemd service in order to do that. So I'm doing a sudo nano /etc /systemd/system, and then I'm calling my service cloudflare.service. And here's the service definition file, which will be in the show notes. I'm simply naming it Cloudflare Tunnel. It starts after the network is online, and it wants the network to be online. And then I'm setting it up for username Scott, and then the working directory will be /home/Scott, and then /.cloudflared. So you'd modify yours for your username. And then we have the environment home location, and then we have the tunnel origin certificate, and this calls out where that certificate is. And then we have a wait for 10 seconds, and then I have the startup of the tunnel, which it runs Cloudflare tunnel, and then we have this tunnel ID that you're going to get from the name of your JSON file. We have a restart on failure and restart in 5 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Control-O and Enter to write the file out, and a Control-X to exit the Nano editor. The next thing I'm going to do is anytime you modify anything in the system service directory folder, you want to be able to do a sudo systemctl daemon reload, which reloads all the updated services if any exist. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and enable the service. Enabling the service makes sure that it runs on the next reboot. And then if I want to start that service right now, I do a sudo systemctl start Cloudflare, and that will start the service now. And we can look at the status of that service by simply doing a sudo systemctl status Cloudflare, and there you can see that the service is up and running. I'm going to go ahead and do a Control-Z, and then I'm going to go ahead and do a sudo reboot as an acid test to make sure my service starts after the Incus container reboots. After the requisite amount of time, I'm going to go ahead and do an SSH back to my container, and I'm logged in again here, and so we're going to turn around and do a sudo systemctl status on the Cloudflare service. We have to provide our sudo password, and then sure enough, our service is up and running. And when I head back up to my web browser and type in PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com and hit enter, it should go to the login screen. Sure enough, it does. I'm going to type in vmsman@gmail.com. And then I'm going to type in my super secret password of 123456. And it should sign on correctly. And sure enough, it does. Just as a point of reference, if you log into your Cloudflare account and go down to DNS records and scroll down in the list, you will see that you have a CNAME record that has been created by the tunnel, as we noticed earlier. My one called Prices happens to be my production tunnel, but the tunnel we created for this tutorial is this one here named PriceBuddy. Now, if I want to go ahead and undo this, I can go over here to this particular CNAME record and go down and click on delete. And that will go ahead and delete the CNAME for PriceBuddy. So now that one is gone. Now what I need to do is I need to go up to quick search here, and I need to type in tunnel, and I want to go to the Zero Trust Networks Tunnels. And if I click on that, that will bring me up to another screen here. And to see our tunnels, we can go ahead and click Networks here, hit the down arrow on that, and do an overview on our networks. And there we have a Manage Tunnels option. So if I click Manage Tunnels, it's going to give me this other pop-out. I can say View Tunnels, and I have two tunnels here, PriceBuddy and PriceBuddy 2. As you'll recall, PriceBuddy 2 was the tunnel that we created here for the purpose of this tutorial. I can come over here and click the three dots and delete this tunnel. And once I delete this tunnel, now there is no connection anymore. And of course, once I delete the CNAME record that I did and I deleted the tunnel, if I go to PriceBuddy.Scotti-BYTE.com, it says that this site can't be reached. So the beauty of Cloudflare tunnels is that you have something where you don't have to open a port on your firewall. That also means that if an application needs to run on somebody's network that has, say, CGNAT, like in the case of T-Mobile Home Internet, a Cloudflare Zero Trust Tunnel is one way to accomplish that, because your network reaches out to Cloudflare and nothing needs to reach out from the outside and talk to a WAN address, because with CGNAT you do not have a WAN address. The only possible negative downside to a Cloudflare tunnel is it only works in the instance where you're talking about a web service. So that means something that uses port 80 or port 443. If you're looking at something like Jitsi or perhaps Rustdesk, which use additional ports besides 80 and 443, a Cloudflare Zero Trust Tunnel will not work for you. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.